Good day. We are Group 1 and we will be presenting our topic, Ethical Frameworks from Various Philosophies.
Before delving deep to the various ethical frameworks from different philosophies, first, let's have an overview of these frameworks and what they are for. But before we can answer that question, we first ask, what are these frameworks of? So, what is ethics? Ethics, according to Brown University, is all about making choices and about providing reasons why we should make these choices. According to Britannica, ethics, also called moral philosophy, is the discipline concerned with what is morally good and bad and morally right and wrong. As we live our day-to-day lives, we are always making decisions, and ethics is the one behind why we do what we do. It answers the questions, how should we live? Or shall we aim at happiness? Or at knowledge? How about virtue? Or the creation of beautiful objects? You see, ethics gives the reason why we choose to act a certain way. It provides us a set of standards for behavior that helps us decide how we ought to act in a range of situations. So now we can ask, what are ethical frameworks? Basically, ethical frameworks are perspectives useful for reasoning what course of action may provide the most moral outcome. So these are principles or set of codes that philosophers have come up with, and this we use to guide our behavior. It is to note though that while each of these frameworks is useful for making ethical decisions, none of them is perfect, and so understanding their benefits and drawbacks can help us decide which is most appropriate for the scenario at hand.
Now on to our next topic, utilitarianism. So what is utilitarianism? According to Jeremy Bentham, utilitarianism is a moral theory to which an action is right if and only if it conforms to the principle of utility. To further explain, principle of utility is when actions or behaviors are right insofar as they promote happiness or pleasure. Actions or behaviors are wrong as they tend to produce unhappiness or pain. The greatest happiness principle states that an action is right if it produces the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. This is the second formulation of the utilitarian theory and was made by John Stuart Mill. So here is Jeremy Bentham, who created the principle of utility. He was concerned with social and legal reform, and he wanted to develop an ethical theory which established whether something was good or bad according to its benefit for the majority of people. Now, this right here is John Stuart Mill, who created the greatest happiness principle. Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and actions are wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness, it intends pleasure and the absence of pain, and by unhappiness, it intends pain and the privation of pleasure. There are two types of utilitarianism. The first one is act utilitarianism, and the second one is rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism is the belief that an action becomes morally right when it produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people, whilst rule utilitarianism is the belief that the moral correctness of an action depends on the correctness of the rules that allows it to achieve the greatest good. Act utilitarianism is also the belief that it is all right to break a rule as long as it brings greater good. But rule utilitarianism is a belief that even if a rule cannot bring greater good, breaking it will not either. Application of the utilitarian theory. For the first example, you attempt to help an elderly man cross the street. He gets across safely. This was a good act since both of you achieved happiness. For the second example, you attempt to help an elderly man cross the street. You stumble as you go, he is knocked into the path of a car and is hurt. This was a bad act since both of you received more pain rather than happiness. Next example, you use 80 soldiers as a decoy in war, and thereby attack an enemy force and kill several hundred enemy soldiers to win the war. This act was a morally good choice because many achieved happiness. Next example is an actual case, the decision at Coventry during World War II. The decision was made not to inform the town that they would be bombed because it would create more pain and unhappiness. And lastly, if lying or stealing will actually bring about more happiness and reduce pain, act utilitarianism says that we should lie and steal in those cases.
To start off, what is virtue ethics? Virtue ethics is a broad term for theories that emphasize the role of character and virtue in moral philosophy rather than either doing one's duty or acting in order to bring about good consequences. So to say, virtue ethics is defined as the one that emphasizes the virtues or moral character. It is the quest to understand and live a life of moral character. With virtue ethics defined from previous philosophical studies, let us now go into the key concepts in virtue ethics. There are two main ideas that circle virtue ethics. These are virtue itself and practical wisdom. In virtue ethics, a virtue is a morally good disposition to think, feel, and act well in some domain of life with regards to the character traits exuded by a particular person or individual. It became a basis of sorts to identify if that specific human being is considered good or bad. Additionally, it is the conformity to a standard of right or to the particular moral excellence with consideration to morality. On the other hand, practical wisdom has an ethical virtue known as eudaimonia, which is defined as the capacity to act based on reasoning with regard to things that are good or bad for humanity. A particular person or individual might know what is the practically reasonably way to act, but has the option to choose not to. To add with, it is the application of knowledge, experience, and wisdom, especially in knowing what is right and wrong. Basing on the defined terms that are closely associated to understanding what virtue ethics are, we have four major principles that virtue ethics aim to teach. The first one is that an action is only right if it is an action that a virtuous person would carry out in the same circumstances. The second one is that a virtuous person is a person who acts virtuously. The third one is that a person who acts virtuously is if they possess and live with the virtues. The fourth and last one is that a virtue is a moral characteristic that a person needs to live well. That being said, there are three questions that are apparently at the heart of moral thinking when virtue ethics is served on the basis. Who am I? Who ought I to become? Who ought I to get there? It might sound a bit old-fashioned, but McIntyre, the modern philosopher who proposed these questions, aimed to provide a guide into following and submitting into such virtue ethics. To give a bit more context, here are virtues associated with the topic at hand. We have the cardinal virtues featuring the first four proposed virtues that are traditionally recommended, and the four virtues that are proposed by Kenan, a modern theologian. Going over to the cardinal virtues, we have prudence, the ability to govern and discipline oneself by the use of reason. Justice, the act of being just and the desire to do what is just. Fortitude or bravery, the reasoned and reasonable practice of patience when dealing with obstacles. And temperance, the moderation of attraction to pleasure and having balance. As for the other four virtues, we have justice, the virtue that requires us to treat all human beings equally and impartially. Fidelity, the virtue that requires that we treat people closer to us with special care. And then self-care, the virtue that declares the unique responsibility to care for ourselves effectively, mentally, physically, and spiritually. Last, we have prudence, which is the virtue that centers on how we must always consider justice, fidelity, and self-care. With all those said, we could now ask what the forms of virtue ethics are. Generally, we have four forms: the eudaimonist virtue ethics, the agent-based and exemplarist virtue ethics, the target-centered virtue ethics, and the Platonistic virtue ethics. The first form claims that the good of the agent and the good of the others are not two separate aims. The importance of this point in virtue ethics is that it reverses the relationship between virtue and rightness. So the virtue is only justified because of the consequences it brings about. The second form is the moral status of actions is entirely dependent upon the moral status of an agent's motives and character traits. Agent-focused theories understand the moral life in terms of what it is to be a virtuous individual, where the virtues are inner dispositions. So there are a variety of human traits that we find, and we can identify these by looking at the people we admire or who are our moral exemplars. The third form considers a virtue ethical account of right action that is opposed to the orthodox virtue ethical account in terms of choices of a virtuous agent. Here, rather than stripping things back to something as basic as the motivations we want, the target-centered view begins where most ethics find themselves, namely with the idea that generosity, courage, self-discipline, and others get a tick of approval. After, it examines what these traits involve. Finally, we have the fourth form, which declares that good agency in the truest and fullest sense presupposes the contemplation of the form of the good. Contemplating the goodness of something we encounter, which is to say carefully attending to it for its own sake in order to understand it, breaks this natural tendency by drawing our attention away from ourselves. Contemplating such goodness with regularity makes room for new habits of thought that focus more readily and more honestly on things other than the self. It alters the quality of our consciousness somehow. With all those considered, we could then say that while there is no general agreement on what the virtues are and how these generally guide moral dilemmas, virtue ethics centers on ethics on the person as himself or herself and what it means to be human. It includes the whole of a person's life for consideration of good and bad.
To continue, what is rights-based ethics? Rights-based ethics are ethics wherein what is moral is that which is in accord to everyone's rights, or in other words, to exercise one's rights ethically, it should not violate the rights of other people. A right can be referred to as a justified claim that an individual or a group can make upon others, or in simpler terms, human rights. According to Thomas Hobbes, he believed that morality is not natural, that if you get a group of individuals who are free, self-interested, and rational, then morality would be formed by them, because they would be able to notice that they would get more benefits in cooperating compared to not cooperating with each other. An example is if there are two communities, wherein one community has oranges and another community has apples. If one community wanted something from another community, and they are in a society that has no rules, the only method to getting something that they want is by stealing it. But since they are rational beings, they would find a better way, and in this case, they would form an agreement. Once an agreement is formed, wherein both parties would be able to mutually benefit, that is when morality is formed. You call this act as contractarianism. Contractarianism, according to contractarians, is right acts that do not violate the free, rational agreements that a group or community has made between each other. This is wherein a bit of freedom is traded for the benefit of cooperative living. There are two types of contracts, explicit and implicit. Explicit contracts, as the word itself explains, is explicit. You mutually benefit from this agreement, and you explicitly agree to this agreement or contract. Meanwhile, in implicit contracts, they are contracts that you never actually agreed to, but we find ourselves in. An example for this is, if you're a naturally born citizen in the Philippines, then you don't explicitly agree to following the laws of the land. However, you still find yourself following these laws. Compared to people who are applying to become citizens in the Philippines, they have to go through a lengthy process, and they have to verbally and explicitly agree to this contract. According to Thomas Hobbes, contracts help the society become not just survivable, but also possible, because it saves you or the society from encountering a situation that Thomas Hobbes referred to as a war of all against all.
Deontological ethics. What is deontology? Deontology comes from the Greek word deon, meaning duty. Deontology is a duty-based ethics that places values on the intentions of the individuals and focuses on the obligations, rules, and duties. This means that actions are either good or bad, right or wrong, based on whether they are consistent with moral duties. Immanuel Kant is considered the most renowned exponent of the ethical theory called deontology. He believed that ethical actions follow universal moral laws such as don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat. He also believed that ethics was about having a good will, that is, a will to do what's right simply because it is right, not because it will feel good, not because it will produce the best outcomes, but because that's what must be done. Immanuel Kant said, "The rightness or wrongness of actions does not depend on their consequences, but on whether they fulfill our duty." Deontology is divided into three theories. The first one is agent-centered, which states that we each have both permissions and obligations that give us agent-relative reasons for action. Deontological constraints are often called agent-centered. The negative ones, for instance, direct people not to do certain things, while not directing them to minimize the extent to which certain kinds of actions are done. The second theory is patient-centered, which is rights-based rather than duty-based. Patient-centered deontological theories are often conceived in agent-neutral reason-giving terms. The third theory is contractualist, which makes the rightness or wrongness of action depend on its conformity to set amoral rules. According to Kant, there are two imperatives or commands. The first one is hypothetical imperative, and the second one is categorical imperative. Hypothetical imperative is a rule of conduct that is understood to apply to an individual only if he or she desires a certain end and has chosen to act on that desire. It is also a conditional command of reason. It does not hold for every single individual at all times and places. Categorical imperative or commands or moral laws all persons must follow, regardless of their desires or extenuating circumstances. It is the central philosophical concept in the deontological moral philosophy of Immanuel Kant. It is a moral law that is unconditional or absolute for all agents, the validity or claim of which does not depend on any ulterior motives or end. Example scenario of deontology. Let's say you've made a promise to another professional that you'll partner with them on a business project. Later on, you find out that partnering with that person might tarnish your reputation. They are known to play fast and loose with the rules, and serious professionals want nothing to do with them. Many people would advise you to cut ties, but deontology reminds us that we are obliged to keep our promises even when they come at personal costs.
Situation ethics. What is situation ethics? Situation ethics or situational ethics is a philosophical position that although there are a few universal truths, different situations call for different responses. Therefore, some actions can be right or wrong depending on situational factors. So, situation ethics also holds that moral judgments must be made within the context of the entirety of a situation and that all normative features of a situation must be viewed as a whole. Who is situation ethics based on? Situation ethics was most famously championed by Joseph Fletcher. He believed that we should follow the rules until we need to break them for reasons of love. It is based on agape love or the Christian unconditional love and says that we should always do the most loving thing in any situation. The four working principles of situationism. Principle number one, pragmatism. The situationalist follows a strategy which is pragmatic. What does that mean? Well, it does not mean that Fletcher is a pragmatist. Pragmatism is a very specific and well worked out philosophical position adopted by the likes of John Dewey, Charles Peirce, and William James. Fletcher does not want his theory associated with these views and rejects all the implications of this type of pragmatism. What makes his view pragmatic is very simple. It is just his abstraction to moral views which do not try to work out what to do in the abstract, but rather explores how moral view might play out in each real life situation. Principle number two, relativism. Even with this rejection of antinomianism and his acceptance of one supreme principle of morality, Fletcher surprisingly still calls himself a relativist. This does not mean he is a relativist in the sense that we can simply choose what is right and wrong. Rather, it is just an appeal for people to stop trying to lay down the law for all people in all contexts. So if situations vary, then consequences vary, and what we ought to do will change accordingly. This is a very simple, unsophisticated idea, like his ideas on pragmatism. And Fletcher just means that what is right or wrong is related to the situation we are in. Principle number 3, positivism. His use of positivism is not the philosophical idea with the same name but rather is where any moral or value judgment in ethics, like a theologian faith propositions, is a decision, not a conclusion. It is a choice, not a result, reached by force of logic. So when challenged as to how he can justify that the only law is to maximize love, Fletcher will say that he cannot. It is not as a result of logic of reasoning, rather it is a decision we take. It is like the theologian faith. Principle number 4, personalism. Love is something that is experienced by people, so personalism is the view that if we are to maximize love, we need to consider the person in a situation. It is the woo of a situation. Summing up, this Fletcher says, love is of people, by people, and for people. Things are to be used, people are to be loved, loving actions are the only conduct permissible. These then are his four working principles, and they are pragmatism, relativism, positivism, and personalism. Thank you.
What is care-based ethics? The ethics of care is a normative ethical theory that holds that moral action centers on interpersonal relationships and care or benevolence as a virtue. Ethics of care is one of a cluster of normative ethical theories that were developed by feminists in the second half of the 20th century. Key themes in the ethics of care include the following: the centrality of caring relationships, the various shared ties of mutuality, the view that caring both establishes and transforms who we are as people, the requirement that genuine caring give rise to actions that address actual needs. Care ethics has important implications of people's relationships, for people as individuals, and for how we might nurture caring values in others. One of the best examples of care ethics being used in modern times is in bioethics. Professions involved in medicine specifically deal with caring for others. As a result, care ethics has become a part of assessing both medical practices and policies.
Good day, everyone. I will be tackling about consequentialism. So, what is consequentialism? Consequentialism is a theory that says whether something is good or bad depends on its outcome. Consequentialism, as its name suggests, is simply the view that normative properties depend only on consequences. This historically important and still popular theory embodies the basic intuition that what is best or right is whatever makes the world best in the future. Because we cannot change the past, an action that brings about more benefit than harm is good, while an action that causes more harm than benefit is not. The most famous version of theory is utilitarianism. So next is, who is consequentialism based on? The paradigm case of consequentialism is utilitarianism, whose classic proponents were Jeremy Bentham. Although there are references to this idea in the works of ancient philosopher Epicurus, It's closely associated with English philosopher Jeremy Bentham. Bentham's theory of utilitarianism focused on which actions were most likely to make people happy. If happiness was the experience of pleasure without pain, the most ethical actions were ones that caused the most possible happiness and the least possible pain. He even developed a calculator to work out which actions were better or worse, the philosophic calculus, because it counted every person's pleasure or pain as the same, regardless of age, wealth, race, etc. Utilitarianism could be seen as a radically egalitarian philosophy. So next is the two principles of consequentialism. Number one is whether an act is right or wrong depends only on the results of that act. So the second principle of consequentialism is the more good consequences an act produces, the better or more right that act. So the last one will be the two example of consequentialism. So the number one example is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism judges consequences by a greatest good for the greatest number standard. The second example of consequentialism is hedonism. Hedonism, on the other hand, says something is good if the consequences produces pleasure or avoids pain. So that's all for the consequentialism ethics. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. Today I'll be giving you a brief overview about applied ethics. Now, first, what is applied ethics? Now, applied ethics is a special branch of ethics concerning solving real problems. Applied ethics is a subtopic of ethics that focuses on applying orthodox normative ethical theories into real-world ethical problems and issues. That is why it is called applied ethics. It is more so concerned in, rather than theories and concepts that exist in a bubble, on applying those theories and concepts into real-life problems. Now, this type of ethics focuses on answering practical issues. Applied ethics focus on real-world application is the key identifier of this branch of ethics. Unlike normative ethics that focuses on theoretical problems to reach an ideal form of ethics, applied ethics focuses on ethical dilemmas that occur in real world, such as suicide and public manners. It questions life, technology, and basically a lot of other human aspects. With applied ethics scope focusing on practical ethical problems, applied ethics has a close association with human aspects such as personal life, private life, professions, health, technology, and law. It has ethics in respect to the decisions, choices, and opportunities we have and make, rather than theoretical problems that do not exist, focusing more on helping make choices with ethical considerations, rather than a theory to guide similar, involving, or associable situations that has not happened yet, if even at all. Applied ethics are. What are applied ethics like? Well, applied ethics asks questions about real moral dilemmas, as we've said before. Some actions and situations that appear in real life can, for the most part, be easily labeled by most as either ethical or unethical. But most problems are not so dichotomous. Many of them stay in an ethical gray area that many people cannot seem to easily make a consensus about. This is where applied ethics shines the most, as it attempts to resolve such complex situations. There are many real-life problems that are applicable for applied ethics: abortion, euthanasia, premarital sex, death penalty, war tactics, censorship. I'm sure all of you have your opinion on this, but that's what applied ethics is for. Forces us to really consider and think about these topics so that we may be able to find the best kind of solution for them. Now, how did applied ethics even came to be? Well, back then, ethics in general, in the past, has mostly been theories. Many classic philosophers in the past have primarily discussed ethics in theories and concepts, but has arguably never genuinely practiced ethics for tackling ongoing issues such as disobedience, suicide, and free speech. However, as humans progressed, so did applied ethics. Around the late 1960s, it is hypothesized that advances in many fields and professions, such as law, medicine, and business, have given rise to many societal problems like civil rights, prisoners' rights, and environmental movements that have interested many philosophers into using ethics and applying them to such concerns. Basically, the problems in society has became just as advanced as our technology and even other systems as well, just like the justice system. And so this basically prompted many people to apply the theoretical and concepts of ethics rather than simply staying as just those. Now, that's it for my brief overview of applied ethics. Thank you.
Feminist ethics. What is feminism? Before knowing what feminist ethic is, we must first know what feminism means. Feminism, by definition, is the belief that men and women should have equal rights and opportunities, according to Emma Watson. So what is feminist ethics? Feminist ethics is the attempt to revision traditional ethics that undermines a woman's moral experiences and knowledge. The feminist approach to ethics aims to tackle disparities that women and other marginalized groups encounter. A history on feminist ethics. Feminist ethics go far back in the 70s, when philosophical journals began publishing articles related to feminism and sexism. While other philosophies did tackle gender, they were more oriented towards male readers. According to Alison Jagger, traditional ethics has failed women in 5 different ways. 1. Inadequate concern for women's rights compared to men's rights. 2. It dismisses problems that occur in a woman's private life. 3. It suggests that women are not as morally developed as men. 4. It overvalues cultural masculine traits over feminine traits. And lastly, it favors culturally masculine ways of moral reasoning. In conclusion, feminism aims to give equal rights to all genders. Feminist ethics aims to build a community where all genders benefit from one another and not one is excluded and marginalized.
And that concludes our presentation. Thank you for listening, and this has been Group 1.